I
Get out of
saw
here,
a
you dirty
man pouring
dog!
bleach into a pregnant Doberman's mouth. What happened next shook me. The whole thing began with a
Get out of
sound
here
that didn't
now!
belong. No bark,
Hey, don't
no
touch
cry
me!
for help,
What is your
but
problem?
something wet and strangled, like someone trying to pull one last breath through a throat already burning. Officer Luke Ramirez, running late afternoon patrol through Copper Ridge, was rolling down a dirt road glazed in red dust when I heard it, the sound slicing through the desert wind like a dull blade forcing its way in. I turned my head, and through a rust-bitten wire fence under a 104-degree ray of sun, hammering the ground, I saw Wayne Harlan kneeling in the cracked dirt. One hand pinned the lower jaw of a pregnant Doberman. The other tipped a half-cut plastic bottle, pouring a stream of clear liquid straight down her throat. The smell of bleach lifted from the air, sharp enough to sting my eyes. The Doberman convulsed her swollen belly, trembling her legs, kicking at nothing. Froth leaked from her mouth, dripping onto the red earth in pale, blistered streaks. I don't remember opening my car door. I only remember the slam of it behind me, the crunch of gravel under my boots, and the sound of my own voice tearing out of my chest. Police step away from the dog. Wayne didn't turn. He kept prying her head back, forcing more of that chemical down as it spilled over his knuckles. And I saw her eyes, the eyes of a pregnant Doberman, clinging to the thinnest thread of life, lift toward me. No panic, no wild fear. Just a look that seemed to say, "I'm still here, if you make it in time." I charged the fence, my hand brushing the grip of my gun, but stopping not because I doubted, but because I knew I had only seconds left to keep her alive. The bleach burned again in the air, tearing at my throat as I yelled, "Wayne, drop the bottle now." Only then did he look at me, cold, empty, like hurting a mother carrying pups was something he did every evening after a drink. I didn't wait another heartbeat. I cleared the fence, kicked aside a rusted oil drum, and lunged forward. The Doberman, who I would later name Midnight, collapsed onto the scorched dirt just inches from my boots, her breath shredding apart her chest, rising in jagged, desperate pulls, as if she were trying to hold on to something thinner than life itself. And I knew if I had been 10 seconds later, she would have died right there in that yard. The silence in Copper Ridge has its own shape. I've been a cop here 12 years, long enough to know it isn't the warm kind born from neighbors who all know each other, nor the tidy quiet of a kind-hearted community, but the heavy kind that settles after people have learned to turn away from anything that makes them uncomfortable. People will lend each other ladders, chat at the gas station, fix a fence together without being asked. Yet if they hear an animal crying behind someone's house, they shut the window, turn up the TV, and tell themselves, "It's none of our business." They choose the comfort of looking away. I know this because I've watched it happen for years. Dogs starved down to bone, and hide cats thrown into garbage bins, horses left in the desert with no water while the sun peeled their skin. Not because people didn't see, but because they didn't want to be involved. Copper Ridge is the kind of place where every news article ends with, "There were no witnesses," not because nobody saw, but because nobody wants to stand up. People here survive by shrinking. I wasn't born in this town. I came to Copper Ridge after my first marriage fell apart, needing a place quiet enough to gather the pieces I'd been carrying, believing the stillness here would make breathing easier. But instead it forced me to face the one thing I'd been running from, my fear of silence itself. I've never been the hero type. Don't like trouble. Don't like throwing my weight around. Don't like being the man who fills a room just to be noticed. But I know one thing with absolute certainty: the fear of watching something wrong happen and doing nothing will kill me faster than any bullet. Maybe that's why the second I heard Midnight choking in that dust-choked yard, I knew I wouldn't step back, not out of duty, not to look brave, but because I couldn't live with myself if I let her die in front of me. Copper Ridge was so hot that afternoon that the trees looked like they were holding their breath. the sunlight punching through the cruiser windows until every inhale felt like metal scraping my ribs. I drove past weather-beaten cabins, dented mailboxes, pickup trucks coated in desert ash. Everything carrying the same quiet message. Everything here has been abandoned a long time ago. I had passed Wayne Harlan's place a dozen times. The warped house, the yard littered with rusted junk, the windows sealed shut, the grass long dead and gold, and although no one liked him, no one confronted him either because a man like Wayne, rough, angry, drunk, more often than sober, was exactly the kind Copper Ridge shrugged at and said, "Let him be. He's in trouble." But that afternoon, when I heard midnight's choking echo through that yard, every "let him be," the town had whispered for years, burned away like paper. I don't know how long Midnight had been suffering there, but I know one thing just as clearly: Wayne wasn't the only one who heard her cry. Neighbors heard. People driving by heard. And no one did anything. That's why, when I ran across the yard and climbed that wire fence, I wasn't just confronting Wayne, I was confronting the whole culture of silence that had hardened this town. When I cuffed Wayne and forced him to his feet, the heat still hammered down like a furnace. Yet inside me, something else had settled, a cold, deep knowledge of what it means to see what no one else wants to see. And I already knew what would follow. No locals willing to testify. A court eager to soften the charges. The newspaper twisting the story. Wayne walking free too soon. But when I looked at Midnight, pregnant belly, heaving breath thin and cracked her whole body trembling under the strain, I knew this too: if the entire town chose silence, I wouldn't. Copper Ridge might abandon her. Wayne might try to erase her. But she had looked at me with a gaze that refused to give up, and I made my decision in that moment: I'll fight for her, even if all of Copper Ridge turns its back. I don't remember how I got over that wire fence, only the scrape of metal slicing my hand, the heat of the dirt rising against my face, and the grotesque sound clawing out of the Doberman's throat, repeating itself like a warning that wouldn't end. Midnight was dying right in front of me, and Wayne Harlan was still pinning her down his knee, grinding into her gaunt shoulder while the half-cut bottle in his hand dripped clear liquid that smelled like bleach, sharp enough to punch straight into my lungs. "Wayne, stop." I shouted, the sound breaking out of my chest rather than my throat. He didn't stop. He didn't look up. He wasn't even startled. It was as if pouring chemicals down the throat of a pregnant Doberman was something he did every evening like clockwork. I lunged forward, grabbed his shoulder, and yanked him backward. He stumbled, the bleach bottle splitting open against the ground and bleeding poison across the red sand. Wayne turned toward me with eyes drowned in alcohol and a kind of cold indifference. "She's sick," he muttered. "I'm helping her." I didn't want to hear another word leave his mouth. I looked at Midnight foam filling her muzzle, her tongue burnt raw, her eyes blazing red as if lit from the inside. Her belly spasmed, each contraction a sign her body was slipping away. Something in me cracked, not out of hatred, but because I was watching a life carrying more lives being pushed to the edge by the very person meant to protect her. "Hands behind your back," I growled. Wayne laughed under his breath. "It's just a dog." I cuffed him harder than necessary, and he groaned, but I didn't apologize. I couldn't. Not while I stood in a yard soaked in bleach and watched a mother Doberman dying because an entire town decided it was no one's business. As I forced Wayne onto his knees, Midnight's breathing shifted, a strained gasp, like someone trying to pull air through a crushed hose. I knelt beside her. "Hey, girl?" "Look at me," I said, though my voice trembled. She didn't look. Her eyes drifted somewhere else toward the wavering heat rising off the ground. I opened the small water bottle from my belt and poured a bit into my palm. "Just a little," I whispered. The water evaporated almost instantly, leaving only a few drops, and Midnight reached for them, one weak, hesitant lick. Then she coughed bleach foam spraying across my shirt. She was in pain. Real pain. But she was trying. She was choosing life. And it broke something open inside me. "Officer." The voice behind me made me turn. Mrs. Collins from across the road stood in the heat haze, her hands trembling around a kitchen towel. I've heard her cry all week," she whispered, eyes fixed on the ground. I was scared to call. It wasn't the voice of someone uncaring. It was the voice of someone a town had taught to stay silent. "You did the right thing coming out today," I said. "I need you back inside." She nodded, eyes watery, and closed her door. I watched it shut. Copper Ridge did this to good people. It taught them to fear their own compassion. I returned to Midnight. She lay on her side, each breath breaking into fragments. Her swollen belly shifted slightly as if the 3 lives inside were tugging at her, trying to keep her here. I placed my hand on her chest. Her heartbeat was so thin I felt as if I pressed any lighter it might disappear entirely. "Midnight." I whispered, still unsure if the name belonged to her, but when I said it, her eyes flickered. She heard me. She recognized me. And she wanted to stay. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 32. I have a pregnant Doberman suspected bleach poisoning. Send animal control and a backup unit. Suspect is detained. Copy Unit 32. The radio crackled in the heat like metal dropped in a furnace. While I waited, I stayed at her side. I wouldn't let her die alone in a yard full of junk and ghosts. Not after what she'd endured. I folded my outer shirt and slid it beneath her head. The fabric soaked up dust, sweat, and the raw hurt pulsing from her breath. "Stay with me," I said. "Just a little longer, Midnight." She closed her eyes. Not in surrender, but as if she were placing her life entirely into my hands. A few minutes later, the animal control truck rumbled up the road, kicking red dust into the air. And I knew I'd won something small in a battle far too big those few extra minutes of life for Midnight. But sometimes, a few minutes is the only thing you need to pull a living soul back from the edge of death. The sound of the animal control truck rolling in felt like the first pulse of life in that dead yard, the old, white vehicle, pushing through Copper Ridge's red dust until the haze parted just enough to reveal Dr. Kayla Monroe's stern face behind the windshield. She stepped out carrying a medical bag nearly half her size, and one glance at Midnight was enough for her to understand how steep this fight would be. "Luke, how's her breathing?" Kayla asked, dropping to her knees beside me. "Weak, really weak. She might have swallowed bleach," I said. Kayla lifted Midnight's lip. The inner lining burned red and streaked like raw paper, and her small sigh landed in my stomach like a weight I couldn't move. "This condition." Kayla shook her head. "She needs a clinic now. Nothing here will keep her alive through the night." Midnight curled inward, a thin whine scraping from her scorched throat, and I set my hand on her head to keep her from striking the ground. Wayne stood a few feet away, cuffed and glassy-eyed, and when he saw Kayla preparing to move Midnight, he smirked. "She's dead already. Ain't saving her." I turned toward him, my stare sharp enough to drive any sane man back, but Wayne only shrugged, and his indifference made me want to throw him into the same poison he'd forced her to drink. I held it in not for him, but for her. Kayla and I lifted Midnight onto the stretcher, her body so light I could feel every rib beneath her thin coat, yet her belly carried weight, the weight of 3 lives fighting alongside her. When we slid her into the transport crate, Kayla touched her neck. "Hold on, Mama. We're moving." Midnight opened her eyes as if trying to cling to whatever hope was left. I placed Wayne in the cruiser before the animal control truck pulled away. He sat slumped in the back seat with a look that suggested he thought he was somehow the victim in all this. As I shut the door, he muttered over a dog, "This whole town's gone crazy." I turned slightly, my voice low and sharp. "No, just you." He scoffed, empty-eyed regret nowhere in sight. I drove to the station in silence. my mind nowhere near the cruiser but chasing the transport truck carrying Midnight down those red dust roads, fighting the chemical fire burning through her body. At the station, I shoved Wayne into holding and started the report, but the smell of paper ink and old air conditioning couldn't drown the bleach stinging from my shirt. When I handed in the file, Sergeant Davis looked at me with a mix of frustration and pity. "Luke, this won't hold in court. You know how the judges are here. I don't care," I said. "I want him charged." Davis sighed. "Luke, this is Copper Ridge. You know what folks say, it's just a dog. They'll say it right there in court. You've done enough." I looked straight into his eyes. "No, I haven't." Davis went quiet, maybe because he knew I was right. When my shift ended, I didn't drive home. I had no reason to. My apartment was just a dim box at the end of town, a place where silence felt heavier than the desert outside. Instead, I drove to Copper Ridge County, Animal Haven. The scent of disinfectant struck me the second I stepped in kennel barks echoing through the concrete like they were rising from the floor itself. Kayla stood at the far end of the hallway watching a small kennel lit by a warm yellow bulb, and when she saw me, she simply nodded. No words, none needed. I walked to her. And I saw Midnight. She lay curled in a thin blanket, her breathing fractured but present an IV taped to her leg, her belly shifting softly, just a faint movement, like desert wind brushing against a window pane. She opened her eyes when she heard my footsteps. Her tail moved, barely but truly. "Hey, girl," I said, kneeling by the bars. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Kayla stood behind me, her voice small but steady. She still wants to live, and if she won't give up, we're not allowed to either. I didn't look away from Midnight, not because I feared she'd die the moment I blinked, but because I knew this was only the beginning. Saving her from Wayne was just the first step. Keeping her alive would be a longer fight, a harder one, and lonelier than anything Copper Ridge had ever witnessed. And when Midnight pressed her nose to the metal bars trying to reach my hand through the gap, I understood I didn't have a choice anymore. I'll stay with her. I'll fight to the end. I went back to the rescue center the next morning because I hadn't slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Midnight lying in the burning dirt with bleach searing through her throat. And every time I opened them, I could only wonder if she was still breathing. When I stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickered and cast a gold tint across the damp concrete floor. The smell of antiseptic cutting straight into my lungs as Kayla turned and saw me, offering only 3 words. "She's still alive." I didn't answer because I couldn't, my entire body loosening like the release after a chase. But Kayla wasn't finished. "She's very weak," she said. "Her body's still fighting." We walked down the hallway to the small kennel where Midnight lay under a draped towel that softened the harsh light, her body curled on a thin blanket, her breathing uneven, but her eyes opening when she heard my steps. That look, fragile, exhausted, but recognizing me went straight through me. "Morning, girl," I murmured. "I'm back." Her tail moved once, just a tiny flick, but in a fight with death, one flick felt like an entire universe. Kayla read her chart. She has chemical ulcers, mild lung reaction, severe dehydration, and stress affecting the pregnancy. But her heart's stronger than expected, Luke. A normal dog wouldn't have survived the night. I looked at Midnight. She's not a normal dog. I sat beside her kennel nearly the entire day because there wasn't much else I could do except be there so she wouldn't feel alone. And every time a door slammed too hard, she startled. Every time another dog barked, she turned toward me as if checking whether she was still safe. She had trusted someone once and been betrayed in the worst way. I saw it in every tiny movement she made. But what hit me hardest was this: despite everything done to her by human hands, Midnight still looked at me with no hatred in her eyes. She was exhausted, but she still tried to understand me. She still tried to trust me. A creature hurt that deeply, and still refusing to give up. What excuse do people have? In the afternoon, she stood up for the first time. I didn't know what drove her to pull herself up like that, pain written in every breath, but she braced on her front legs, trembling, and then slipped back down. I jumped up. "Slow down, girl. Take it easy." Kayla came beside me and rested a hand on my shoulder. "It's a mother's instinct. She's checking if the pups are still okay." "Are they?" I asked. Kayla nodded. "Their heartbeats are strong. That's almost a miracle." I looked at Midnight, her chest rising and falling in strained waves. No one in Copper Ridge would call her a miracle. They'd only see a dog. But to me, she was teaching me something I didn't know I'd been missing to protect someone. Sometimes you have to stand, even when your body feels broken. That evening, I reached my hand through the kennel bars and let her decide whether she wanted to come closer. At first, she only stared for a long time, not afraid, but thinking, trying to understand whether I was another version of Wayne or something else entirely. Then she leaned forward. Her head touched my palm with a gentle, deliberate nudge, like a quiet, "I'll give you a chance." My throat tightened. One small touch, but to me, it felt like she'd handed me the right to stand on her side. A right she didn't offer to many. "Good girl," I whispered. "I'm here." Behind me, Kayla gave a small smile. "She chose you, Luke." A mother dog never chooses wrong. I left the rescue center close to 11 the moon, thin as a silver thread hanging over Copper Ridge, and the moment I stepped outside I realized something I didn't want to leave. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but because in all my years as a cop, no living being had ever looked at me the way Midnight had today, brave but shaking weak, but still wanting to believe. I glanced back toward the kennel window, the warm yellow light inside casting her shadow as she curled around her belly, shielding her unborn pups with whatever strength she had left. And I understood immediately I would return every day, every night, every time she needed me. Not just to make sure she lived, but because I wanted to witness the moment she finally stood strong again, not for my sake, but because she deserved a world nothing like the one I'd found her in at Wayne Harlan's yard. That was the moment I realized this simple truth. Midnight wasn't just healing. She was pulling me back to life with her. 3 days after Midnight started drinking water again, I thought we'd crossed the worst of it, and I was naive to believe that. That night, Copper Ridge was colder than any night before, the wind whipping against the old metal sheets behind the rescue center until they rattled like a dying machine. And I walked in still carrying the smell of sand and engine oil from my patrol. The moment I stepped into the hallway of Animal Haven, I knew something was wrong even before I heard my name. Kayla ran toward me, her face drained of color. "Luke, she's seizing." It felt like someone drove a fist straight through my chest. We sprinted to the end of the row where Midnight lay on her side, her body jerking so violently the blanket beneath her bunched into hard ridges, her front legs twitching, her stomach tightening her claws, scraping senselessly across the concrete. Midnight. Hey, girl. Look at me," I said, but she couldn't. Her eyes flicked wildly, pulled by a pain I couldn't touch or drag her out of. Kayla knelt and held her head away from the wall. Delayed toxin surge, she gasped. Bleach can flare up hours later. We knew it was possible, but not like this. She didn't need to explain because I heard only one thing: Midnight was slipping back into the dark. Kayla pushed an anti-seizure dose into her vein, and I held her hind legs to keep her from thrashing my own body, shaking not from fear, but from the helplessness that made me want to tear the room apart. "She'll lose the pups if this keeps up," Kayla said quietly. I looked at Midnight's belly, 3 lives trying to survive inside a body being destroyed piece by piece. No, Midnight, don't quit on me," I whispered. And as if she heard, the convulsions slowed, then weakened, then stopped. But Midnight didn't get up. She lay still, her chest rising in faint, fragile lifts like a thread stretched thin across desert wind. I set my hand on her ribs, counting each broken breath. "She may not make it through the night," Kayla said. "If you want to stay, I'm staying," I cut in. "No matter what." Near midnight, the rescue center was so quiet I could hear the heating bulb clicking on the ceiling, and Midnight still hadn't opened her eyes. I sat on the floor in front of her kennel, knees pressed to the cold concrete, one hand through the bars, so my palm could rest against her cheek. The worst nights of my patrol career never hollowed me out the way this one did. This wasn't my case. This wasn't my duty. This wasn't something a Copper Ridge cop was supposed to get tangled in. But looking at Midnight, her thin frame, her rounded belly, her fevered coat, her breath trembling toward nothing, I felt like I was kneeling beside the last friend I had in the world. Wind slipped through the back door gap, carrying the smell of wet dirt and decaying leaves, and I reached into my jacket pocket for the thing I'd kept for 10 years. The broken badge. The badge was split by a bullet the night I lost my partner, the night I failed to save the person I should have saved. I always kept it not for honor, but because it reminded me of the day I fell short. I placed the badge on her blanket right beside her head. "Midnight," I whispered, "I didn't save him, but I won't let that happen to you. Not again." She still didn't open her eyes, but something happened that almost made me break. She moved her head slowly, weakly, and her nose touched the broken badge. Just a touch. But I understood. She knew I was there. She knew I wasn't leaving her. It was our first ritual of healing. She gave me her trust. I gave her my promise. Around 4 a.m, Kayla returned to check on her, leaning down and pressing her ear to Midnight's chest, then looking up at me with something new in her eyes. Her heart rhythm stabilized. Seizures fully stopped. She's fighting Luke. I couldn't speak. I covered my face for a moment to keep the sound in. Midnight still lay motionless, but her belly rose with steadier breaths. She didn't win this battle because of medicine. She won because of the strength buried somewhere inside her, and because of the one thing no needle can deliver: hope. I put my hand on her head again. "Good girl. You did it." And for the first time that night, her tail moved. Very faint, but the clearest sign of life I'd ever seen. I left the rescue center just as the sun began turning the sky orange, the ridge wind brushing my face, and the desert scent I once hated suddenly feeling like something I was grateful for. Midnight wasn't safe yet. Her pups weren't safe yet. The story was far from over. But for the first time since I found her in Wayne Harlan's yard, I believed we could do this. She was fighting, and I would fight with her. Midnight survived that relapse night as if fate itself had decided to give her a second chance, and she seized it with everything she had left. 3 days later, when I walked into the rescue center, Kayla said a single sentence: "She's standing." I thought I misheard her, but when I reached the end of the hallway, Midnight was there, legs trembling, her back arched slightly from lingering pain, but upright, looking at me with eyes no longer clouded or afraid. Eyes clearing like something light had been struck awake inside a soul once tortured. "Good girl." I breathed out, my voice so soft I barely recognized it. Her tail wagged harder than any day before, as if she were saying, "I'm still here." I didn't give up, and I felt that truth more powerfully than anything spoken aloud. On the 7th morning, Kayla told me something that locked my throat in place. "Luke, it's time. She's going into labor." We prepared the small back room, laying blankets, setting a heater, turning the lights to a warm gold, and I sat on the floor beside her, with my back against the wall, my hand resting against her cheek as Midnight pressed her head into my knee like it was the only anchor she trusted. The pain came softly at first, then harder. Kayla worked quickly, each motion deliberate and calm, and half an hour later, the first cry rose thin, small, but unmistakably alive. Then another, then another. 3 tiny beings, 3 heartbeats. I once believed would never exist. Lay curled in blankets warm and flush their mouths, searching for their first breath of life. Midnight stretched toward them and licked each one gentle but certain the quiet authority of a mother, reclaiming what almost never reached this world. And somehow in that moment, the bleach-stained yard, the seizures, the stench of death, all of it washed out of memory, leaving only warm light and 3 fragile breaths. Kayla touched my shoulder. "Luke, she did it." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I only lowered my head and pressed my forehead gently to Midnight's. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," I whispered, and I knew it wasn't kindness. It was true. A week later, the rescue center allowed me to take Midnight and her pups home to foster, and I prepared everything, soft bedding, water bowls, a fenced yard with new wood still smelling of sap. When I opened the car door, Midnight stepped down slowly, her nose brushing the earth as she inhaled deeply, as if it was the first breath of her life without poison, without fear stalking behind it. The pups slept in the basket I carried. Midnight looked at them, then at me. And for the first time in my years as a cop, I felt I wasn't just bringing someone home, I was bringing myself back to a piece of decency I thought I'd lost long ago. That afternoon, I sat on the porch steps, Copper Ridge sunlight resting on my shoulders, while Midnight lay beside me with the pups nursing against her, the breeze carrying the scent of dirt, new wood and life. I looked at her and said, "We made it." Midnight lifted her head, narrowed her eyes gently, and pressed her nose into my palm, a small gesture, but one I understood deeper than anything spoken. She forgave this world more than the world ever gave her reason to. It's something only creatures without words know how to do. And in that moment, I realized something simple and vast. Some beings can't speak our language. Yet, they teach us how to be human. Copper Ridge stayed quiet the way it always had, but I wasn't the same man anymore. I looked at the 3 pups sleeping at midnight, shielding them with the same body that had almost been destroyed, and I whispered to myself, "This is what real justice looks like. A justice with no courtroom, no arguments, only a heart wide enough to shelter the small lives the world left behind."